John Maynard Keynes, the British economist whose theories shaped macroeconomics for decades, once wrote in 1923 in a tract on monetary reform that this long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we're all dead. His diagnosis was probably based less on pessimism and more on his belief in government economic interventions when timely and appropriate. After all, what use are economists and forecasters if, in temptatious seasons, they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again? Despite what seems like a dismissal from Keynes of what happens in the long run, the difference between the state of the economy in the short and the long run does seem to matter for the level of employment that Keynes holds as critical to understanding turbulent business cycles. First, what do we mean by the short and the long run? Depending on what you're analyzing in economics, those terms can have multiple, if not similar, meanings. In macroeconomics, the short run typically refers to the period of time in which prices, especially the prices for factors of production like labor or sticky prices, don't respond to changes in the economic conditions. In contrast, the long run is a period of time distant enough in the future that we can reasonably expect all prices in the economy to be subject to change, including labor. First, let's grasp what the long run represents, because it's apparently what Keynes thought economists focus too much on. The long run in this case represents the trend of what we would expect from an economy's output in terms of real GDP. That expectation can be really best informed by what we estimate to be the potential output for the economy. Our potential output then is assumed to be the same as what we would expect in aggregate supply or produced output in the long run. That's one of the reasons why the long-run aggregate supply, or LRAS curve, is a straight line running vertically over a single point on the x-axis on real GDP. For whatever year we're modeling, we must have a single estimate of what we think real GDP would be based on the long-run trend of how the economy performs, which is assumed to be estimated by the potential output for the economy. But what makes up the potential output of the economy? How do we estimate it? Potential output is the level of output an economy can achieve based on roughly four factors about that economy: its natural level of employment, its stock of capital, the productivity of both labor and capital, and technology. Technology is probably the hardest part of this equation to quantify, and for the sake of making Keynes' point, let's assume that productivity factors are all exogenous constants, or variables we assume are given to us from outside of our model and unchangeable. In this controlled model, the natural level of employment is the key determinant of potential output, or the position of the LRAS curve. And as we can deduce about labor markets from our simple supply and demand model, the real wage that causes a demand for labor that matches the supply of labor willing to work at that wage will reveal the equilibrium or natural level of employment in the economy. But wait, if that price variable we're looking at on the y-axis in the labor market is real wages, and it's already controlling for inflation and deflation, or changes in price levels across the economy, that's why the LRAS curve is a straight vertical line coming out of the x-axis. Every factor that goes into determining it is independent of the price level in the economy, including the dependent variable being expressed, real GDP. So we can safely assume that if the estimate of real potential output is correct, then it represents the expected trend for the economy regardless of whether prices in the economy climb or fall. Great. Now that we get that, what was Keynes getting at when he described the long run as misleading? Well, consider that for real wages to reach and stay in equilibrium, nominal wages would need to change every time inflation or deflation happened. And it simply doesn't. This is the foundation of the sticky wages theory. The U.S. economy has been experiencing decades of inflation since the 1970s that has effectively flattened the real effect of federal minimum wage hikes. Unions tend to secure contracts that lock in proportional wage increases over a window of time, regardless of the actual rates of inflation. Procurement specialists usually seek out long-term contracts with suppliers to lock in costs of resources and capital assets. And consumers generally expect the price of commodities like rice and beans to remain stable from year to year. There are a lot of reasons to suspect that for some immediate period of time, the prices of some goods and services, particularly those that are inputs into other goods and services, can remain stagnant and lag changes in the price of final goods and services. In other words, the price of output in the economy. For Keynes, that was critical because that put producers in a difficult position when they've locked in a 5-year contract for repair services on their trucks, hiring unionized drill operators under a negotiated wage for the next 2 years, and now face a disruption like, say, a pandemic that slashes demand for oil and plummets the price of the barrels they were about to ship out. In that position, the most rational decision seems to be to cut or negotiate a reduction in your workforce. Through a macro lens, it would seem like the employment level of the economy would be the variable that would determine the slope of the aggregate supply curve in the short run. As prices rise in the economy, it's rational to expect producers to increase output, if for no other reason than taking advantage of the difference between their nominal labor costs and their growing nominal sales revenue attributable to the higher market prices. The reverse holds true too. Less inflation, or in fact deflation, would deter producers from making additional units of output, seeing narrowing profit margins between their cost of labor and the sales revenue. The most efficient outcome of compensating entrepreneurs for their opportunity costs in competitive markets across a macroeconomy would suggest that the most common difference between any position on the short run aggregate supply curve is the amount of labor being employed. More labor would reasonably create more output. All of this behavior makes the short run aggregate supply curve slope up, giving it a positive relationship with the price level. This is what Keynes meant by the long run being misleading. In the long run, an economy has an expectation based on what could happen, but that expectation was based mostly on an expectation of employment. And if employment changed, which it likely would in the short run because of the difficulty of changing labor and other input costs, then there could be wide deviations, gaps, between our expected trend and what happens in the economy in any given year. Millions of jobs could hang in the balance. How should we deal with those gaps? Should we deal with them? Find out next.